of the quote unquote cure to this whole thing was having somebody come in and teach each of these students, hey, listen, when you go in for a test and your hands are sweaty and your heart's racing, that's called anxiety. How many people here experience anxiety? Oh, I have. Okay, when you don't do as well on a test that you really want to do and you feel really angry at yourself, that's called sadness. How many people have felt that?
I'm Heather Grzych, and this is the Wisdom of the Body podcast. This podcast explores the idea of body intelligence as the real key to learning the knowledge of life, or what we call Ayurveda in the ancient language of Sanskrit. We do that by connecting with today's creative leaders and experts who will help you listen to your body, trust your gut, and live in deeper harmony with nature. Come join me as we unlock the golden door to clear, direct perception and become very deep listeners. You can find the Wisdom of the Body podcast on Apple, Spotify, and Stitcher. You can also follow us by joining my email at heathergrzych.com or on Instagram at heathergrzych. I know you're going to love this podcast, so take a second right now to subscribe. Today, I'm here with Lee Kravetz. He is the author of the national best-selling novel, The Last Confessions of Sylvia P., which was the millions most anticipated pick and a Good Morning America Reads pick, as well as acclaimed nonfiction, Social Contagion, and SuperSurvivors. He has written for print and television, including the New York Times, New York Magazine, Psychology Today, Daily Beast, San Francisco Chronicle, and PBS, and he teaches at Dominican University of California in their MFA program. And he lives in the Bay Area like me in Berkeley. And we're chatting across the Bay today. Thank you so much for being here with us today, Lee.
It is a total blast. I love this. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, podcasting is fun.
I will do a podcast any day. A long time ago, I used to work in book publishing. I worked in Penguin. And it was way before podcasts. And we had these things called blogs. And blogs were like the new big thing. And then when the podcast came out, I was like, it's like a blog. But this is much cooler.
Yeah, because we can chat and live and all this stuff. So had an interesting career so far. It seems as if, you studied psychology and then you sort of pivoted into writing. And one of the things I love how you write both fiction and nonfiction. As someone who's sort of dabbling across genres right now. And fiction and nonfiction is kind of like tricky for the reader sometimes to even know what the difference between the two is, especially these days, it seems, with all of the things that are going on with AI and deepfakes and things like that.
Oh, man, you name it. You did. I mean, I'll tell you, I'd always wanted to be a novelist. The problem with writing nonfiction is that you're stuck telling the truth. And it always sort of got in the way of a good story. So, I think writing nonfiction, you've got to actually find the interesting story in the path to find that interesting story in that true way. And then, fiction becomes its own sort of like problems because you've got to make it all up. There's nothing to sort of guide your way. So it's not an easy career path that we've chosen.
Yeah. I find fiction really hard to write. And it's been hard for me. We'll have to talk about that one some other time. I want to talk about you today and how did this happen that you actually went from studying psych? Because it's funny, I actually studied psych in undergrad.
So I wound up going to graduate school to become a therapist. And I moved back from New York to California. And I loved it. I loved getting my master's degree in psychology. The thing was, I still had this writing bug. And I wound up writing my graduate thesis. And when I turned it into my advisor looked at it and said, this is great, Lee. The problem is 3 times longer than everybody else's graduate thesis. And he was like, and it's actually really interesting because most people, when they write about psychology, they're always talking about the negative side of psychology. They're looking at depression, anxiety, PTSD, what we used to call access to, psychoses, like narcissism and bipolar disorder and antisocial personality disorders and things like that, access 1 and access 2 stuff. And that's what we write about because that's what therapy is about. But I found this fascinating sort of sliver. It's something called post-traumatic growth. And it was the idea that we could take bad things that happen and we do not negate those bad things. We don't say, pretend there's no depression. pretend there's no anxiety, there's no PTSD. You have to go through that if you go through trauma. That is, in some ways, you can't bypass that. But at the same time, what the research showed was that 80 to 90% of us at the same time also grow from these experiences. So there's no silver lining with trauma ever. But when it comes to how we endure afterwards, like how we bounce forward after trauma, not just bounce back, but bounce forward, there's some really cool stuff happening. And so at the time, it was called positive psychology, the realm of positive psychology. And very few people were really talking about it at the time. This is like 2010. And so my advisor was like, "Hey, what do you want to do with this?" And I said, "Well, I'd love to publish it. Let's see what we can do." And the next thing I knew, I got an agent and I sold it to HarperCollins. And so when I was graduating with my master's degree and getting my hours, my first book was coming out. It was called SuperSurvivors. And it's the idea that, basically I follow 7 people and they're all going on their life trajectory and they each have this catastrophic trauma. Each one is a different trauma that stops them in their tracks. And then based on certain principles of positive psychology, they were able to not only change their lives for the better, but change other people's as a result of their survival. And so that became Super Survivors. And I was like, well, gosh, I wonder if I could parlay this into a full-time writing career. And then it became, I wound up writing my second book, which is called Strange Contagion. And it takes a look at positive psychology, not just from an individual standpoint, but from a macro standpoint. It looks at a town that has this catastrophic trauma that happens. And it talks about all the factors that go into it and how we use positive psychology to sort of bring ourselves out of that. And then from there, I moved on to fictions.
Yeah, you know what? Let's hang out on social contagions for a minute here because I think, and you wrote that book before the pandemic, right? 2017. And I was like, he must have had quite a trip here during the pandemic. Like, even we all had a trip, obviously, but you probably had a different kind of trip than everybody else observing as well. And in your book, you referred to social contagions as the ways in which others influence our lives through catchable thoughts, emotions, and behaviors. And as I was going through your book, because I've studied Indian medicine, Ayurvedic medicine, and learned a whole lot of words in a different language that I had never heard of before growing up, that explained things to me, concepts that no one really ever taught me about. And so as I was going through your book, I was like, wow, that sure sounds a lot like this in Sanskrit. And, we could totally nerd out on that. But
You should totally. But there's something to that all of these ideas, there's nothing new. And in fact, if you go back to like Eastern medicine and Eastern philosophy, which are two sides of the same coin, we see that a lot of the stuff that we're looking at today we've known forever. We've known forever. And a lot of it is just repackaging. And that's sort of the art of writing nonfiction, is taking something that's been said a million times, repackaging it and saying something, showing us something new about it. I mean, positive psychology, like the idea of studying this sort of stuff, started around 2010 out of UPenn, Martin Seligman and his whole team over there. But if you go back to Man's Search for Meaning, people were writing about this stuff in the 1940s and 1950s. You can go back even further, and there's a lot of Eastern philosophy that goes into positive psychology, being mindful, the idea that happiness truly is contagious, that hope is truly contagious, just as much as sadness is contagious, depression, absolutely contagious, anxiety, hugely contagious, eating disorders, massively contagious.
okay, talk about that because, your book focuses, like you said, a lot on these sort of suicides in a community that ended up, they were catchable, where a slew of kids in this one school all committed suicide in a similar way. And then you wrote, because, you're trying to understand this phenomenon, you wrote about bulimia, and that blew my mind. Then after you explained it, it made sense. Can you talk about what you found in the bulimia research?
Yeah, absolutely. So anorexia has been around there's been cases reported for, 1,000 years on anorexia. But bulimia really only came about in the 1970s, which really sort of blew my mind, right? You figure it'd be around as long as everything else, but it really started in the 1970s. And the idea of what happened was There was a researcher in London who was studying anorexia, and he saw some odd cases, and not a lot of them, that were cases of bulimia. So the idea is, so anorexia is where you stop eating. Bulimia is where you do activities, including binging and purging, to sort of get down to a certain weight level. Anorexia is about image. Bulimia is about feeling a certain way. And so he was noticing that there were a couple of cases, like 7 or 8, that people were binging and purging. He was like, well, this is sort of interesting. And he writes a paper about it, a single paper about it. And this paper gets included in the DSM-3. So the DSM is the diagnostic manual. And with every single psychological diagnosis that you can possibly imagine, it's in the DSM. And the third version of it came out. And this was included in the DSM-3. Okay. Then you got all these women's magazines that start reporting on this DSM-3 diagnosis. This all happens within a year and a half period of time. And the small cases of bulimia that this one psychiatrist had been noticing exploded into millions almost overnight. And what happened is people started to learn that you could do this. And then the impulse started to spread and the behavior started to spread. And over time, within 10, 15 years, it had become a massive epidemic of, it was actually a pandemic of bulimia. And in 1996 or 1997, Princess Diana comes out and she wants to shine a spotlight on bulimia, the crisis of bulimia, and she's trying to do a good thing. So she comes out on national TV, international TV, and she says, I want to say that I've suffered from bulimia my whole life. On the one hand, it shines a light on this problem and how we ask the world, like, how can we help make this better for people? How can we treat it? At the same time, we saw a massive explosion of bulimia because people who had never heard of it before or even thought about doing it suddenly caught the idea and the behavior that they should do it. So that's how remarkable and how contagious, how sticky some of these ideas can be.
It's just insane. I mean, I'm trying to think, is it sort of like Schrodinger's cat? I don't know. It's like once something comes into our conscious awareness, but it's more than just our conscious awareness that is
It's the
influencing
unconscious.
this.
Well, it's the unconscious, really.
Yeah.
So, I mean, on a basic level, if I yawned right now, if I even say the word yawning, you're going to start to feel that impulse to yawn. If I start smiling, you're going to start to smile. Even if we weren't looking at each other, but you hear in my voice that I'm smiling, you're going to get that impulse to smile. The physiology behind it's really fascinating. It's these mirror neurons in our brain that basically are designed to mimic what's around us. And then when these mirror neurons sort of flash, it convinces our body to respond in kind to what they are representing. And so on an unconscious, non-conscious level, our bodies are sort of influenced by our environment around us. And in some ways, this is just basic behavioral psychology, which I love. My new novel that I'm working on is based on this whole idea of behavioral psychology, that if you change your environment, you change how you think, feel, and behave. And all you have to do is change your environment. And that's it. Why? Because our mirror neurons flash and fire based on stimuli that we, on a conscious level, don't even recognize is happening. I met a professor at NYU, and we went and we talked. He's the head of sort of cognitive psychology and behavioral psychology. And we sat in his office and he had posters on the wall. And he said, when I have contentious meetings with staff or students, I have them sit in this part of my office, which has a cool sort of color scheme and, very like a calm couch. Because when they're in here and they're upset about something, I can non-consciously influence them to actually be more receptive to each other and not heighten things. If I brought them into a part of the office where like the color scheme was bright white and there was harsh light and the sound was a little bit harsh, that would influence the way that the conversation went as well.
Yeah. So I think we all feel that, and to know that there's an intuition that we have about that anyway, right? And so the fact that there are people who've studied the specifics of that and can help people design environments like that is so great. The question though is, yes, we affect each other, but are certain people more susceptible to being affected by each other? Are other people less susceptible? Is there something that you found in your research that would Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so it's such a great question. So yeah, there are people that are more susceptible than others. Part of it has to do with the fact how our brains are wired. We all have mirror neurons, but in the case of Gun High School, where you had 10 students die by suicide, about a year of each other, six within a year, all in sort of very public ways, which is very rare for suicide. What we found is that if there's a combination of factors, if there's depression, anxiety, a lack of social awareness, a lack of understanding ourselves, there are certain pressures, there's certain biases that we sort of come equipped with. We're not sleeping very well, we're not eating very well, then all of a sudden our systems are sort of built up in this way that when we are affected by stimuli around us, we respond in a certain way. So there was never any sort of connective tissue that the CDC, when they came in to investigate this phenomenon, found. It wasn't like, oh, every student here was depressed.
Or they were all eating Doritos every day after dinner.
Right. Most of these kids did not even know each other. These are kids that were sort of in different classes and in different, but what they did find was that they had a very similar combination of factors that pile on top of one another. So yeah, there was mild to moderate depression, but there was a lack of attunement. So when you and I talk, and let's say that you and I were not making eye contact with each other, but we see each other every day. Because we're sort of like attuned to this stuff, I might say, "Hey, Heather, so you seem sort of sad today. What's going on?" And you would say, "Oh, yeah, I'm feeling sort of sad, or I have a headache because I didn't have coffee, or whatever it is," right? What they found with these kids at Gun High School in particular was that when they weren't making eye contact with each other, nobody knew that there was something wrong, that that was a red flag. When kids were staying up all night to study and then could not sleep for days and days and days, and they would come to school like zombies, the student who had been up for 4 days never said, "Hey, I don't think this is right." And nobody around them recognized that something was wrong. So what happened was, because there was a lack of understanding that what they were experiencing was classic depression. Classic depression.
This is probably a sensitive question, but when you say that no one around them noticed, is that saying that their parents didn't notice? Like, were their parents working a lot? Were they in single family households? Like, why were they so unwatched?
Unwatched. So part of it was, you've got to think about the culture that this particular school is in. So it's in Palo Alto, California. You're surrounded by engineers, very, very, very smart people who have prized, for better or worse, academic success, career success, all measured by money and esteem and the type of schools that you get into. You don't really prize emotional attunement in that scenario. So the kids were mirroring their parents, who are very little concept of depression, anxiety, or that what it even looked like, what sadness looked like, what grief looked like, what struggling looked like. It was just binary. You either are succeeding or you're not succeeding. On top of that, Palo Alto is super, super expensive. So you have this implicit, not explicit, but implicit sort of thing where if I'm driving around in my neighborhood and I see this dumpy house on this corner, and I know that in order for me to even afford a dumpy house like this, I've got to be able to pay $4 million just for a dumpy house. What it implies to me as a student is I've got to go to Harvard or Stanford just to make sure that I can make $4 million just to get a basic house. And they're living in this bubble, which that's all they know. So you have all of these pressures that are sort of implied that you're sort of carrying around. And so, yeah, the parents don't even know that the students are feeling this way. The parents don't have any sense that they need to worry about this. And then they're surrounded by a pool of students who are feeling and thinking the exact same things and not sort of recognizing it. So part of the quote unquote cure to this whole thing was having somebody come in and teach each of these students, hey, listen, when you go in for a test and your hands are sweaty and your heart's racing, that's called anxiety. How many people here experience anxiety? Oh, I have. Okay, when you don't do as well on a test that you really want to do and you feel really angry at yourself, that's called sadness. That's called sadness. How many people have felt that? I mean, it sounds so rudimentary. It sounds so kindergarten.
Yeah, that's they were doing with my son in kindergarten last year.
Oh, they were? That's
Yeah.
exactly they need to go
Yeah, that's what they were doing.
they need to teach kids how to recognize their own thoughts and feelings.
Yeah, and, because you have kids, right?
Oh, yeah, got 2.
It's challenging, as a parent because you feel yourself when your kid I do, I don't know if you experience this, but when my son gets upset, my empathy kicks in, and I wanna cry with him. And I have to be like, "No, you're the parent, you gotta pull the kid out of this. You gotta help him." And you could see how that pull, if you go one way or the other too far, where you indulge in the emotions and pain with them, or that's one end of the spectrum where you, like, overindulge or whatever, and then you'd get triggered, and then on the other end of the spectrum, which is, "No, I'm just gonna cut him off, I'm not gonna let him feel," and be like, "Nope, let's just, work ourselves out of this." Yeah, what do you do? What's your approach with that?
Honestly, I always go too far on both sides, and then I try to figure out in the middle. I mean, one of the things that's so human about being a parent is, this is total self-disclosure, but I always feel like I'm screwing up. Always. I always feel like I'm not being emotional enough or empathetic enough, and then I'm being too emotional or too empathetic. And there's no winning, it feels like. And at some point, you just got to tell yourself, you're doing the best you can, and the kid is 99.9% is going to be fine. Most kids, at least in their 30s, figure it out.
Yeah, I guess we're kind of all destined to be screwed up by something, but we as parents don't want to feel that guilt.
Awful.
I know.
Which is contagious, by the way. Guilt is
Guilt
totally.
is contagious?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Guilt is contagious.
Do you have an example of this?
Well, I have a lot of friends who will tell me that they feel bad that they rush their kids to get out of the house each morning, and that the morning is awful for kids and awful for the house. And they'll say that they feel awful that they had to yell and scream at their kids to get out of the house. I suddenly feel really guilty. It's not like I'm yelling and screaming at their kids to get out of the house, but then I'm thinking to myself, I understand that. And I feel that stress every single morning. And I wonder if my kids are feeling that way. And all of a sudden, before I know it, I'm feeling that guilt, which has nothing to do with me. But then, I can relate to it. So
Yeah.
that's an easy example of contagious guilt.
Yeah. You also mentioned in the Strange Contagion book that people wanting to become pregnant, that you found that there's a social contagion with that as well. And I wrote a fertility book. I know a lot of people who listen to the podcast are people who are interested in their fertility either because they want to have a baby or they're having problems with their reproductive system or something related to that. What did you find with that?
It's more about an intent to want to have kids versus convincing your body that your body needs to become pregnant. So there's a couple of sort of interesting things I found. So we sort of think of there's a wives' tale, an old wives' tale, that women who live together, their cycles sync. And it's actually not true. All the research shows that it's called the Bender-Meinhof philosophy, the idea that we start to see something and then we start to see it everywhere, but it's not true. For instance, the idea like, I want to get a certain car, and then all of a sudden I start to see this car everywhere. So obviously more and more people are buying my car. But it's just sort of an internal bias we have. What we really find is that when cycles start and stop at different places, and the odds of one starting when another one is in the middle is pretty high. It's like a 1 in 4 shot that you're going to be sort of synced in some way, shape, or form, but they're never really totally aligned because there's no sort of hormonal sort of mirroring that's happening. But what we do find when it comes to fertility or wanting to get pregnant or getting this idea that I want to try to have kids, that idea, that desire is highly contagious. And we see it like not even just in the pregnancy realm, but okay, 24, 25, 26. Why is it that all of our friends are suddenly getting married?
You didn't live in an urban area when you were 24, 25, and 26, did you?
No, I lived in rural Texas where people were getting married at 17. It
Because
was
everybody's
awful.
doing that like 5 to 10 years later in cities.
Oh my God, seriously. It was such a confusing thing for me. I moved from Texas to California and I was like, why is nobody married and having kids? And I got married at 28 and I felt I was old. But then at 29, I was like, oh my God, I'm so young. Why did I get married so young? So it's like, but that itself is sort of a contagion too. When you're in the urban setting, why do you wait so long to get married? It's a
True.
contagion.
Yeah.
Everybody else is waiting. But it's the same thing with kids. And so when we decided to have kids, it was when everybody else started having kids. And that's why all of our friends have the same age kids. I mean, a lot of
Okay.
our friends, so that's sort of the contagion that happens.
So I'm not one of those people. I've always been like an outlier of all of my social groups. I had a child when I turned 40. I was in
Wow.
school in Ohio when, right after college, all my best friends got engaged right after graduation, married a year after that, baby a year after that. It was like boom, boom, boom. And I was there during that time when all that was going on. And I somehow knew that I wasn't going to do that. Then I always knew that I was going to wait. I didn't think I would wait as long as I did. I wanted to do it in my early 30s and tried with my ex-husband and it didn't work and we ended up getting divorced and stuff like that. But I always knew I was going to wait. And so I'm really curious about this because I mean, I know how we look at immunity in a body and how we look at susceptibility to certain types of imbalances. And we have different like categories of imbalances, and they're loosely correlated with various emotional states. And I know what in a body physically, which does have an influence from the mind and the environment, what it is that protects the body from that. What is it that protects the mind from these things? And how do you know what you need to be protected from versus not?
So, I mean, there's so much in that question. It's a beautiful question. So, part of the insidiousness of social contagions, basically, is that we don't know that we are catching them and we don't know that we are spreading them. It's like COVID. We don't know if we have it and we don't know if we're spreading it until after the fact, right? Until you're 3 days into it and you're awful and you're feeling awful. So part of it is just recognizing. Honestly, how do we protect ourselves? We recognize that it is possible. And we recognize that everywhere we go, we are a vector for these sorts of things. One of the most beautiful stories that I remember collecting for Strange Contagion, 10 students had died at Gun High School. 10 students had died from suicide. And that year, the drama department decided to do, I'm trying to remember what it was. It was a musical of some sort. And it was sort of like a rompy sort of musical. And the idea was that they weren't going to do like a dramatic Shakespearean play, which is what they normally did in the spring. But this year they decided they're going to do something fun with a lot of music. And what was amazing was that the phenomenon we watched was that the people who were in the play recognized that emotions were contagious, and they purposely went out and started singing these beautiful poppy songs. And the people who were on stage started feeling better. And then the people who were in the audience started feeling better. And then the people in the audience would bring that home, and the people that they interacted with would catch their happiness. And we know that this happened not because we did any studies with this particular thing, but Yale did a happiness survey. And they found that one person's happiness trickles down and spreads by 3. And so there was a study that was done by University of Chicago where they studied a hospital. This is incredible. So they knew in some ways that emotions were contagious. Well, how did they study this? Well, the staff at this hospital, this particular hospital, would purposefully go to each other and say, "Hey, how are you doing today?" To each other. Or it looks like you're having a bad day, or let me buy you a cup of coffee. Just a little tweak in their day. Right. What they found was that the patients started healing faster. And then the people who came to visit them, to visit the patients, left happier. And if you follow that trajectory from the Yale study, in theory, their friends and neighbors would start to feel happier too. And so we see that the health status of everybody in this particular hospital, the prognosis was just better because happiness matters. And so how do we protect ourselves from the bad stuff? Well, we just sort of aware that this is going around, but we can also sort of counteract by actually sort of smiling more and being attuned to each other. And even when things are going bad, saying, "Hey, I see you." And that act alone, it saves lives. I mean, it physically, like we have evidence to show that people who go into a hospital who are interacting with doctors and nurses and triage staff who are happier heal faster.
Yeah. Honestly, like, this is just making me think how much more valuable yoga is, especially, I mean, for so many populations, but I just experienced myself. I was a different human after doing yoga, after meditating daily for 6 years. I was just a different person. I could feel things differently, things that I discounted before, things that I didn't feel. And since you were talking about doctors and hospitals and medical staff, one of the people I interviewed on the podcast was Dr. Jonathan Fisher, who's a cardiologist. And, he's a yogi. He's a yogi doctor. He went out and studied all the woo woo, touchy feely, get into your body stuff. And he's really making a difference with people. And this stuff is amazing. Unfortunately, we don't make a lot of time for these kinds of things, you know?
I met an anesthesiologist one time, and he was really into virtual reality right when VR was really starting about, I don't know, 70 years ago. And what he would do is he would have his staff do a virtual reality training where they are a patient. And in the virtual simulation, they're in a bed and they see doctors all around them talking over them. And he says to them, how does it feel to know that you aren't allowed to talk to them, that you can't interact with them? And now watch this. And then he does a simulation where the doctors start talking. And he says, to his trainees, what does it feel like when the doctors are talking to you with a calm voice and a smile on their face? What he's doing is he's training medical technicians and, physicians that bedside manner matters tremendously. I mean, is it going to cure cancer? Probably not. But it matters about how the patient actually sort of experiences that treatment. And we don't need to have a positive attitude in order to survive. So that's really important to know. But it certainly makes life
Oh,
a
my
lot.
grandma, who's 91, who's miserable and grumpy and complains all the time, she's a testament to that.
I love that. One of the best things I ever learned, the first things I ever learned, was that you don't need to have a positive attitude to survive. In fact, there are people who have really positive attitudes who are the first to go because there's no correlation. Thank God there's no correlation between positive thinking and survival rates. When people go through traumatic experiences, whether it's at gun high school or it's any personal trauma that we have, thank God you're going to feel negative. You're going to have negative thoughts. And if it took positive thinking to survive, we would all be screwed.
And, back to the fertility thing, one of the parts I remember from your book was about how group therapy, I don't know why you were talking about this in terms of the bulimia, I think, that how group therapy can really work for people and how group therapy can essentially reinforce and make it worse for people. And I will tell you, that's why after I wrote my fertility book and I briefly had some group programs that were designed for fertility, and I just started to see how people were like comparing themselves too much. And I could see that it was good for some of them and bad for others. And how I just was like, I don't know that this is the right way to talk about this stuff in this setting. And I know there are a lot of these groups out there, but I started getting all the people that were like, that couldn't be in those groups anymore.
It's interesting. Before I became a writer, my book was about to be published. I was getting my hours and I was doing it at Stanford Fertility. That's where I did my hours. So I did it for 2.5 years. And then my book came out. I got licensed and then I started diverging into writing full time. And we used to lead groups.
So you never saw clients, or did you?
I
You
did
have a
see
practice?
clients. I saw clients. I still actually have a couple of clients who I've had for a couple of years. And it's nice to sort of, keep your
Wheels
finger on the
greased?
exactly. Totally. And I think it's always great. And you always have that sort of impulse to help people. That's the benevolence that sort of comes from this stuff. And you love it. And I love people. So it's sort of a misnomer that writers are all introverts because I struggle every day because I want to hang out with people all the time. And I have to sort of say, no, I've got to write. But no, when I did the fertility treatment stuff at psychology at Stanford Fertility, I led 3 or 4 groups every week. And oh my gosh, yeah. I saw the contagion, the behavioral and emotional contagions spread like wildfire. And the people who suffered the most did not stay in those groups. And those who liked either spreading the behavior and the emotion, because there's safety in numbers, or didn't realize it, or got something else out of it, stayed. And they would stay for years and years and years and years.
Wow. That was my gut instinct about it. And it's amazing to hear your experience with it. Originally when we were talking about me interviewing you, because your last book is the Sylvia Plath book. And I feel like my reaction to finding out that you wrote a book about Sylvia Plath is very related to the topic of conversation, because I was like, I don't know that I can talk about that book.
Yeah.
Because when I read that book, The Bell Jar, I'm sorry, that book, your book is different. You're writing a book about Sylvia Plath, who wrote The Bell
In the
Jar,
bell
which,
jar, right, exactly.
yeah. And I was like, that book made me want to kill myself.
There's something to that, right? There are famous books, famous stories about people who read things and then the main character shoots himself in and then they go out and do it. Absolutely. And there were people who read the bell jar and felt and did the exact same thing.
I mean, obviously it didn't have a lasting effect, but like I was depressed for like 2 weeks after reading that book, I remember. And I was like, this really had an effect on me. I've noticed that about like certain horror movies. It would like freak me out so much that it would like carry forward for a couple of days and stuff. And anyway, so I have not like exposed myself to anything related to Sylvia Plath since then, because I'm like, that affected me so much. And I thought it was interesting that you chose that or her as an author or as a character to write about, and also the topic of your strange contagion being so focused on suicides. And I was wondering, did that lead to your interest in Sylvia Plath, or is that what happened?
Yeah. So Sylvia Plath famously died by suicide at the age of 30. The funny thing is, when I wrote The Last Confessions of Sylvia P., her suicide never really factored into it for me. What factored into it was I started to read about the mental hospital that Sylvia Plath was in when she was, I think, 19 years old. And she was there for about 6 months. And that's actually what The Bell Jar is about. It's a fictionalized version of her real life story. And what I realized was poetry was the thing that saved her. And that to me was the beautiful thing. So, yes, suicide is like terrible. She had bipolar disorder. And basically, I love this idea.
Manic depressive, is that what it
Thank
was called?
you. Yes,
Yeah.
manic depression.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Psych undergrad. Psych undergrad.
It's paid off. It's paid off. But so she had manic depression. And what was amazing to me is that she was encouraged by her psychiatrist, Ruth Barnhouse, to write about the things that no one else wanted to hear. And so she was the person who came up with confessional poetry, this idea that you confess your innermost thoughts and feelings, put them to the page. And she did it so well and so naturally, and other people would read it. And maybe it was a contagion, but more along the lines, it was more likely it was that people related to it. Like when people are thinking about suicidal ideation, well, a lot of people think about suicidal ideation. When people are talking about sexual experiences that you don't talk about publicly, she wrote it down and people read it and were like, oh, I've had those too. And darker stuff too, rape, incest, all of these sort of things, daddy issues, all of these things that are sort of part and parcel with psychology today, she was writing about. And that was the thing that got her out of her manic depression. That was the thing that sort of got her moving. And she lived another 10 years after that, having found her place. And what was even cooler was that the idea of confessional poetry, this whole movement of literature, was born not in a university. It wasn't born in a very cool town. It was born in mental hospitals. In mental hospitals, all from people suffering from the same manic depression. Robert Lowell, Anne Sexton, Sylvia Plath, all of these sort of very famous confessional poets, well, they were hospitalized. And they came out and they started writing about the things that nobody's supposed to write about. And that's what made Sylvia Plath Sylvia Plath.
And that's what got you intrigued about that topic.
Just blown away by it. I mean, she was beautiful. And oddly enough, I actually fell in love with the book again, The Bell Jar, when I was working at a mental hospital. So I saw it there and I started reading it. And I was like, oh my gosh. What I'm reading here is basically there's a hidden story about the birth of confessional poetry and how we can sort of use literature to uplift ourselves and to find our truth.
Oh, I love it. So you like went into the thing that everybody else, including me, is like, that's darkness. And you went in there and you found the little like lotus growing in there.
Oh my God. Well, I'm reading it and I'm like, so there's a character in there. There's a psychiatrist character, and she shows up at the last third of the book. She's only there for a little bit, but she's like the only psychiatrist who's kind to Sylvia Plath's character. And I was like, oh my God, she's the hero of the book. She's totally the hero of the book, and people have totally missed it. She's the one who saves Sylvia. She's the one. And she's also the one who, in my mind, creates confessional poetry. She's the one who says, Sylvia, all these things that people are telling you not to talk about, I want you to write this stuff down. And I want to see what it is that you're feeling. And she does. And we have, the letters to show how in real life, Sylvia Plath worked Ruth Barnhouse, who the psychiatrist character is based on. And Ruth Barnhouse writing to Sylvia going, I want you to write your experiences. And Sylvia writes to Ruth Barnhouse, I'm thinking about writing about my experience at the mental hospital with you. That becomes the bell jar.
Wow.
It's pretty impressive.
Pretty impressive, and also great that you're able to write about topics that overly sensitive people like me could probably deal with.
I love it. I love it. I think that it's great. And I tell you, the fact that you write about this stuff, the fact that you do a podcast on this, that you've really sort of changed your life and really are living this is just a testament to how wonderful this stuff works. And, we're all sensitive human beings. And if we can sort of lean into that, we can grow and become the best versions of ourselves, or at least more enhanced, deeper versions of ourselves.
Very well said. Thank you so much, Lee. I got one more question for you today.
Bring it.
What does the wisdom of the body mean to you?
The wisdom of the body, in my mind, if I was thinking about it, I would say that it is the ability to hold on to every experience and for us to implicitly understand, if not explicitly understand, that every experience gives us a skill to move forward with. Whether it's trauma or happy experiences, each of these things makes us who we are and who we're going to be. And we shouldn't reject that. We should sort of like own it. So every sort of, rather than run away from the things that we try to avoid from our past, we should really hold on to, because those are the building blocks for what's coming. I'm turning 47 this summer, and I feel wiser than, not because I've learned so much, but because, 47 years, there's a lot of wisdom that comes from experience, both good and bad. So I think that's the wisdom of the body. And you are basically a living encyclopedia, a vessel of experiences that you get to just draw from moving forward. So that's sort of how I see it.
Certainly a lot more to write about now.
Definitely. Oh my God. Yeah. There's not enough time. That's the problem. That's my thing. I'm having major existential angst right now. I'm like, there's so much I want to do and so much I want to write about. And I'm like, oh my God, time is short, totally short. So I think my next book is all going to be about existential angst.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Thanks so much, Lee. Great conversation. Really love chatting with you. Thank you so much for being here.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
If you are embarking on a fertility journey and are ready to have your mind blown about what your body is really capable of and how it's impacted by the environment, then check out my book, The Ayurvedic Guide to Fertility. You can actually download the introduction to the book for free on my website at heathergrzych.com. That's Heather, GRZYCH.com. Read the intro for free and then buy the rest of this fertility enlightening book pretty much anywhere books are sold. You want a full human experience when you seek a healthcare provider, and you don't want 15 minutes with someone who can't even try to find out the root cause of things because they're so overwhelmed themselves. You have a body, a mind, a heart, and dare I say it, even emotions. You're not crazy. Everything does affect you, and it's possible to feel better if you have the support you need. Set up an appointment with me to heal naturally. Go to heathergrzych.com. That's Heather, GRZYCH.com. Thank you for tuning in and dropping in with us today. Don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review this podcast. I really want to hear your feedback. To learn more about my work, visit heathergrzych.com. That's Heather, GRZYCH.com. And meet me here next time on The Wisdom of the Body.